to The Case For, a Baseball Hall of Fame podcast. I'm your host, attorney and baseball fan extraordinaire Russell Christian. On each episode of this podcast, we examine a different Major League Baseball player's career, and I'll make the case for whether I believe this player does or does not deserve enshrinement in the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum in Cooperstown, New York. If you're someone who marks the calendar until the day pitchers and catchers report to spring training, just like Edmond Dante marking the walls of his cell in the Chateau d'If, then this is the podcast for you. Friendly reminder, I've never played professional baseball. I'm just a fan. I'm also an attorney, and believe me when I say it's way more fun to debate the pros and cons of a player's hall-worthiness than it is to study legal recourses for wrongful imprisonment under the Napoleonic Code. All right, it's enough County Monte Cristo references for you. Great book, great movie. The subject of our 10th episode is switch-hitting center fielder Carlos Beltrán. Now, if you've listened to my episodes in the past, you know I make the case for each player's induction in 3 parts. I look at statistics, hardware, and what I call the fame factor. As to statistics, I look at traditional stats as well as advanced sabermetric statistics. With regard to hardware, I look at awards received, recognitions, honors, achievements, and I also like to look at postseason accolades. It's really important to me. I like that. Finally, I like to explore the fame factor just because I think it adds some fun, some mystery, and a little poetry to the whole discussion. If we get a soapbox for a minute, this Hall of Fame discussion, if you're into this Hall of Fame discussion, you're online, or you're talking with folks in person about this, there's a tendency to sort of look at the numbers and approach this as if there's some sort of magical equation for entry. The great part of this, as I've mentioned on some of my episodes, there's a lot of players I probably won't be discussing, only because it's like, what's the point? I mentioned before, I won't be talking about Adrian Beltre before this year's vote, because I think he's going to get in, and I think he's got over 3,000 hits. Is really, what's the point of talking about it? It's really, for me, more fun to talk about some of these borderline candidates, because then it gets into your perspective, and different people have different perspectives on what they think is important in a Hall of Fame resume, and I try to take a look at all 3 of these different factors, because I don't think one single factor is sort of outcome determinative. I think you need to look at the sort of totality of a player's career, take into account a lot of different factors. I think there's a tendency sometimes, especially with the advent of advanced sabermetrics, to look at something and think, well, X plus Y equals this, and look at this Hall of Fame debate as if there's an equation that sort of answers it. There really isn't. It just depends on your perspective. And at the end of the day, like I always say at the beginning, it's the National Baseball Hall of Fame Museum in Cooperstown, New York. It's a museum dedicated to baseball. And people go there and they look at plaques of some of the greats of the game. And, just friendly reminder here, don't take things too seriously. It's a fun debate. I like baseball. I like the game of baseball. I like talking about baseball. And there's no right or wrong answers. So, you can have your opinions. I'll have mine. But let's keep the debate fun and friendly. I think it's a fun debate to have. So today's episode is going to be really interesting. I say that every time. I know people are probably thinking, well, you say that every time. But today's episode is going to be really interesting because, just like I was saying, there's no right answer. Each player has a different case. And different players have different, what I call sort of elevator pitches for what makes them a compelling candidate for induction into the Hall of Fame. On my Joe Mauer episode, for example, I sort of made the pitch. His elevator pitch might be, best hitting catcher. Or the Andrew Jones episodes, his elevator pitch might be, greatest defensive center fielder. And that's sort of maybe a reductive summary of a player's career. And of course, we get into the stats. We talk about it for a while. But Carlos Beltrán's career is really interesting for 2 reasons. One, and I'm just going to come out and say it now. I don't want to get too far into it, and we'll discuss this more in the fame factor, but he's the first player from that 2017 Astros World Series team to be on the Hall of Fame ballot. This is his 2nd year on the ballot. And, I don't want to get too far into it. If you follow baseball, you know what I'm talking about. If not, look it up. The 2017 Astros, there was a bit of a scandal with some sign stealing and banging on trash cans, all that sort of stuff. And I think for a lot of baseball fans, they've been trying to figure out how that's going to impact players' Hall of Fame chances moving forward. Specifically, one player who's currently playing is Jose Altuve. He's got a great Hall of Fame resume, and a lot of people are scratching their heads saying, is this going to impact his Hall of Fame chances? Well, we'll get into it. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but Carlos Beltrán was on that team and kind of seen as sort of the ringleader to that. So this is going to be sort of an interesting litmus test, this Carlos Beltrán vote, to see how voters are going to be reacting to this, more recent scandal. Kind of one of the biggest scandals in baseball since the PED scandal, for being honest, at least kind of on the field type scandal, not get into off the field issues. It's going to be interesting, like I said, to see how voters react to Beltran and whether or not they vote him in. And that's going to, I think, sort of set the tone for how voters in the future handle players like Altuve and Carlos Correa when he gets up and stuff like that. So it's kind of interesting. The other reason that Carlos Beltran's case is interesting is because when you look at his career, we'll get into the stats here, of course. He's got really, really good career numbers. And I say this before in some of my episodes, that there's some players who play, and while they're playing, you may not be thinking this is the best player in the league or this is the star, but you might be thinking, oh, this player is really good. And then consistently year in, year out, they're just putting up good numbers. And then when they retire, you look at their body of work and say, wow, I knew he was a good player, but wow, when you put it in this perspective, I didn't realize he was that good. I don't want to use this term. If you follow the Hall of Fame debate or the baseball debate, there's a term which can be very divisive. And I'm not necessarily saying it's a bad word, and I'm not necessarily ascribing it to Carlos Beltran, but it's one that is out there in the discussion of Beltran, so I'll come out and let's talk about it. The term is a compiler, and I see lots of times people refer to Carlos Beltran as a compiler. That brings up two questions. One, is he? And two, is being a compiler, bad? The first one, we'll get into the stats. I don't think it's fair to call him a compiler. For those of you unfamiliar, I like to keep this podcast open, to anyone, regardless of your background, how much you know about baseball or not. A compiler is someone traditionally who, again, at the end of their career, you look at their career numbers and say, wow, this person put together great career numbers. But then when you break it down season by season, you really don't see maybe necessarily a lot of dominating seasons, but just by virtue of the fact they played so long, they put out some good numbers. You see that a lot in pitchers, and that's not necessarily a knock, but I can think of some pitchers off the top of my head that I felt like growing up, there was just a lot more pitchers that were pitching 25, 26 years. I remember Nolan Ryan and Charlie Huff, some of these pitchers that just pitched forever. Phil Niekro, and here's another one. But there's other pitchers like that pitched for over 20 years, and you look at the career numbers, you think, wow, this is pretty good. And, you look at the career, maybe they didn't necessarily dominate. So sometimes a compiler, that the phrase can be sort of a negative phrase. But in another respect, it can be kind of a positive phrase. It's another way of saying this player, year in, year out for a number of years, just put in, excellent seasons. So I don't want to get too far into it, but I don't think it's fair to necessarily call Carlos Beltran a compiler. And I also don't think it's necessarily a knock against a player to be a compiler. So that's all I'm going to say. I don't really want to spend a lot of time debating, is he a compiler, whether a compiler is a good thing or not. But without further ado, the only way to really get into this is to get into three-part analysis: stats, hardware, and the fame factor. So I don't want to get off on the compiler issue or the Houston Astros issue. So without further ado, let's just get into it. Let's make the case for Carlos Beltran. Carlos Beltran was born in Manatí, Puerto Rico. It's on the north coast of the island, roughly about 20 miles west of the capital, San Juan. As the name implies, Manatí is named after the manatee, of course, the famous sea mammal you see a lot in the Caribbean and in Florida. So if you're out there boating, go slow in the no-wake zones. You don't want to hurt the manatees. Beltran was a good athlete growing up, and he played baseball and volleyball, but he eventually concentrated on baseball, where he was drafted in 1995 out of high school by the Kansas City Royals. That would be the team he'd start his career with. Now, I want to point out an interesting little note about his origin story. If you remember in our Billy Wagner episode, we talked about how Billy Wagner was right-handed, but broke his arm and then taught himself to pitch left-handed. It's just an incredible story of adversity. Kind of similarly, Carlos Beltran was a right-handed hitter, but when he made it to the minors, he decided he wanted to become a switch hitter. Actually worked in the offseason while he's in the minors with Bernie Williams, famous New York Yankees switch hitter, in order to become a switch hitter. I just think that's fascinating. It's not like he grew up a switch hitter. He learned on the fly in the minors how to switch hit. So that's just an impressive little note about Carlos's baseball origin story. Beltran would spend the next 4 years in the minors, including a stint with single-A Lansing Lugnuts. I got to mention that team. He used to live in Michigan because they just truly have one of the best absolute minor league team names in the world. So I had to mention his time with the Lansing Lugnuts. Sadly, though, Beltran initially struggled in the minors, including some of that time with the Lugnuts, but he was young, and he did show a lot of promise, and the Royals really stuck with him, and by 1998, things started to click. In that 1998 season, he batted .352, very impressive, with 14 home runs in 47 games for Double-A Wichita Wranglers, before he eventually made his Major League debut on September 14th, 1998, for the Royals against the Oakland Athletics. Now, in that game, he got his first hit and his first walk, and he scored 2 runs. So he started off his career right and just kept on going. In fact, so much so that in the next season for the Royals in 1999, he hit .293 with 22 home runs, 108 RBI, and 112 runs, and won the American League Rookie of the Year award. So it just came right out of the gate and was very good, very impressive. He would eventually go on to play 20 seasons in Major League Baseball with 7 different teams: Kansas City Royals, Houston Astros, New York Mets, San Francisco Giants, St. Louis Cardinals, New York Yankees, and the Texas Rangers. And at the end of his 20-year career, we're going to start sort of at the end here, Carlos had some really impressive statistics. I mean, I talked about it before. I think he's sort of unfairly considered a compiler. We'll kind of go in some of his years, but you have to really stand there and marvel at some of his career statistics. Let's break them down a little bit. 1,582 runs. That's 52nd all-time, just 1 run behind George Brett. And he's got actually more career runs. I found this fascinating. More career runs than Tim Raines, one of the stolen base kings, him and Ricky of the 80s. The guy was just stealing bases, scoring runs like crazy. So he's got more runs than Tim Raines, and he's got more runs than Miguel Cabrera, who retired and is going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. So he has 2,725 hits, which is good enough for 62nd all-time. He's got 1 more hit than Hall of Famer Roberto Alomar. And he also has 565 career doubles. It's 28th all-time. That's more career doubles than, get this, Eddie Murray, Chipper Jones, A-Rod, Manny, Jeter, and Tony Gwynn. Now, if y'all listen to this podcast, you know I'm a huge fan of 2 things. I'm a huge fan of doubles, and I'm a huge fan of Tony Gwynn. So I got to mention, he's got more doubles than Tony Gwynn. Interestingly, too, kind of a side note here, this is kind of a big year for doubles guys on the ballot because Carlos is 28th all-time. We did our episode on Todd Helton. He's 20th all-time in doubles. And another guy who's on the ballot this year, Bobby Abreu, is 24th all-time for doubles. So a lot of doubles machines on this year's ballot. Kind of interesting. Carlos has a very impressive 435 career home runs. It's good enough for 47th all-time. He's got 1 more home run than Andrew Jones, who, as you know, I did a podcast episode about it. And in my opinion, I think Andrew is a Hall of Famer. So places him very favorably. Carlos has 1 less home run than Andre Dawson, another Hall of Famer. So he's in good company there. Now, to be fair, and I mention this every time we have a player with more than 400 home runs, there's a lot of players that have more than 400 home runs that aren't in the Hall of Fame. And there's a few players with more than 435 home runs that aren't in the Hall of Fame and probably won't be. Now, some of that's because of PED, but there's some non-PED guys who have, in the 400 home runs who probably won't be in the Hall of Fame. So if you're looking at Beltran purely as a home run hitter, then probably no. There's a few other guys, and I think I've mentioned them in some of the other episodes, who have home runs of more than 400 that aren't in the Hall and probably won't be, are kind of seen as sort of one-dimensional players, either hit a home run or strike out. Adam Dunn's, I'll just call him out now. He's a great player. He could crush a ball a country mile, but he was kind of a either home run or strikeout kind of guy. He had a lot of strikeouts. A great player. I don't think he's ever going to get in the Hall of Fame. So, again, having more than 400 home runs doesn't guarantee you induction, but this places him very favorably. It's pretty impressive. Carlos also has 1,587 RBI. That's 41st all-time, just behind Andre Dawson again. It's also more RBI than Rogers Hornsby, Harmon Killebrew, and Al Kaline. Little segue. I like to get on segues. There's kind of a fun debate going on this week on baseball Twitter about whether RBI is already plural because it's runs batted in, or whether you should say RBIs. I'm not going to get too far into it. It's kind of a fun debate online. If you're on the baseball Twitter, you've probably been following it, so it's kind of a fun debate. So if I slip and say RBIs, and I don't want to offend anybody, I'm reading this real fast. I got a full-time job. I'm trying to do this research and record this podcast on the weekend. So don't shoot me and send me hate mail if I mispronounce it. So anyway, segue over. Carlos also has 312 stolen bases. We'll get into this in a bit here because it's an interesting part of his resume. He's 159th all-time in stolen bases, so he's not getting in as a speed threat alone, but as we'll talk about in a second, his combination home run and stolen bases really places him favorably amongst some of the all-time greats. Now, his career slash line, he's got 279 batting average, 350 on-base percentage, 486 slugging, which are very, very good, but not going to necessarily get him in the Hall of Fame on those numbers alone. To contrast, in the Helton episode, Helton has got a really, really good career batting average on base percentage. In fact, that's one of his strongest arguments, if I recall, my elevator pitch for Helton, in addition to just being sort of Mr. Rocky, was having a really good batting average, good on-base percentage, and a high doubles amount. Those were really some key parts for him. So Carlos Beltran's not going to necessarily get in on the strength of the batting average, on base percentage, and the slugging, although those are good numbers. And as we've mentioned on the Andrew Jones episode, Andrew's got a pretty low batting average. Even Dale Murphy, one of my favorite players, if not my favorite player growing up, kind of a low batting average. The 279 is not going to, it's not low enough to say, oh, he can't get into the Hall, but it's not a career batting average or a 300. If he had a 320 average or something like that, it's a huge part of his resume. So those numbers, the batting average on bases, slugging, very impressive. Certainly not going to be a knock against him, but not going to really move the needle up. So kind of average, the scales are balanced there on that. He's got a career 837 OPS too, which is very good. One counting stat I want to focus on, I talk about how I'm a doubles fan. I'm also a total bases fan because some players can be, maybe they hit a lot of home runs, but, maybe they're bad at running the bases. They don't get a lot of doubles, triples. I think total bases is a good sort of counting stat to show how good they are because it takes into account, those of you who don't know, total bases is your, as the name implies, your total bases, sort of home runs, triples, doubles, and singles. It takes into account power, plus being able to hit for singles, plus the occasional double and triple sort of counts into speed a little bit. Carlos has 4,751 total bases. That's 34th all time. Now, I'm going to break this down just a little bit because I want to focus on this as one of the components of his case. Carlos is just above Gary Sheffield, who I did my episode on. Gary Sheffield's at 35, or 35th all time with 4,737. So Carlos is 34th all time. If you look at I like to do this, as you know, if you look at the 33 players above Carlos on this all-time total base list, it's just like a who's who of all-time greats. They're all Hall of Famers, with the exception of ineligible players who will make the Hall of Fame. You got Pujols and Cabrera, Adrian Beltre, who I think is going to make it this year, and then some of the Hall of Fame caliber players who aren't in for other reasons. You got Bonds, A-Rod, Pete Rose, Rafael Palmeiro, Manny Ramirez. So, as I say in the music world, this album, these 33 guys, all above Carlos on this career total base list, this album's just got all the hits. It's all killer, no filler right there. If you look at those players, the 33 players above Carlos and all-time total bases, it is just a murderer's row of yes, these are all-time great players. So I like to do that lots of times on stats, as do a lot of people, to say, hey, look, this places him very favorably amongst the all-time greats. I also think it's interesting, too. Beltran has more total bases, and bear with me, I'm going to list off a list of Hall of Famers that Carlos has more career total bases than, and you're looking at Robin Yount, Rogers Hornsby, Craig Biggio, Ernie Banks, Jim Thome, which I thought was impressive because he played a long time, Ricky Henderson, Frank Thomas, Tony Perez, Mickey Mantle, Vlad Guerrero, Roberto Clemente, Fred McGriff, and Ivan Rodriguez. These are some kind of Mount Rushmore type players almost. There's a great interview online, a little bit of a segue, Shannon Sharp and Ken Griffey Jr., and Shannon asks Ken, name some of your Mount Rushmore. He puts Ricky Henderson on his Mount Rushmore greatest of all time. That's pretty fair. And Ricky was one of the all-time greats and played a long time, had over 3,000 hits. So, I won't dwell too much on it, but just this career total basis for me is a big deal. So while I'm here, got to segue a little bit. Talking about this laundry list of Hall of Famers here and total bases, it's worth mentioning that smack in the middle of this list at 56th all-time, with more career total bases than Mike Schmidt and Eddie Matthews, is Dave Parker. Now, I want to take a little bit of a segue here. I've been very busy the past few weeks discussing candidates on this year's upcoming Hall of Fame ballot. But when we're done, when the Hall of Fame vote is announced in January, I want to get back to what I kind of was doing in the first 2 episodes, which is discussing some more historical players. And one of the players I am so excited to get into is Dave Parker, the Cobra, as he was known, his nickname. I've mentioned this on my Twitter account. I think I've said it on the podcast before. The 3 players that inspired me to make this podcast were Dale Murphy, Dave Parker, and Thurman Munson. So I'm very much looking forward to the Cobra episode. So shameless plug segue over, had to plug that. Let's get back to Carlos. I mentioned before the power stolen bases combination. His home run totals alone, if your elevator pitch was that Carlos was a great home run hitter, well, his home runs fall a little bit short, but still very impressive. If your elevator pitch is he's a stolen base threat, he's got a lot of career stolen bases, but doesn't place him amongst the all-time greats. But, and this is maybe one of his best arguments here, this might be his elevator pitch, what I'm about to get into right here. If you look at players with 400 or more home runs and 300 or more stolen bases, you're looking at a very short list of Barry Bonds, Alex Rodriguez, Willie Mays, Andre Dawson, and Carlos Beltran. That's it. And to me, that's pretty impressive. Now, I want to say that with the caveat, it's kind of fun when you get into this Hall of Fame debate. And one of the things that people do is they'll say, when you look at list of players with this combination of stats, and sometimes it's funny because you can tell people are reaching. They say, oh, players with, 50 or more intentional walks, 9,000 plate appearances. Sometimes you look at the combinations, you scratch your head, and you're like, okay, now you're reaching. But, these are pretty major statistics here. Home run, stolen base, power combination. I brought up a similar combination on the Sheffield episode, which I thought was really important. But I want to narrow this down even further. And again, these aren't, obscure stats. These are home runs, stolen bases. If you were to narrow this list of players down even further, A-Rod, Bonds, Mays, and Beltran are the only players in MLB history with 2,500 or more hits, 400 or more home runs, 300 or more stolen bases, and 1,000 or more walks. So Andre Dawson drops off of that exclusive list because I didn't really know this until I researched this. Andre Dawson only had 589 career walks. Apparently didn't walk a lot. So that's just, to me, really, really exclusive club. And another thing, too, when people look into this Hall of Fame debate and they say, only these players have X, combination of stats, it's kind of funny because if you follow the Hall of Fame discussion, if you're into baseball stats, you know what I'm talking about. Whenever people do this, I feel like it's they narrow it down and it's like Hank Aaron, Babe Ruth, Willie Mays, and then, outlier X. And sometimes it can be funny because, as I said, the combination of stats that people put together, it's like, now you're reaching. But again, these are some pretty significant. You're looking at hits, home runs, stolen bases, walks. I mean, these are the meat and potatoes of a player's offensive production. So, you can't make this stuff up. We're not searching here. This isn't some obscure, range factor plus, stolen base efficiency or something. I mean, these are pretty major stats. So to me, that right there is probably his best elevator pitch in terms of his sort of compiled, career stats. So it's pretty impressive. I mean, again, A-Rod, Bonds, Mays, Beltran, that is pretty exclusive territory. But if I could go a little further in this, one of the websites I like to use is StatHead. A lot of you folks that, do this sort of baseball analysis, you use it. And one of the features that's great, there's a function where you can punch in players' names, and you can kind of compare their stats head-to-head. I did this a little bit in the Lou Whitaker episode. I compared him and Alan Trammell's stats head-to-head. But if you punch in these 4 guys in the career comparison, A-Rod, Bonds, Mays, and Beltran, it's really interesting. Now, in all fairness, the other 3 guys, really lead Beltran in every stat and category and with regard to hardware. But there's one thing they all have in common. They all have only one World Series title. And that's kind of another part of Beltran's resume. These 4 guys we're talking about here are all only part of one World Series championship team. Now, we're going to discuss Beltran's postseason success and the fame factor, but it's fair to say Beltran, he had better postseason success than these three other players, with the caveat, of course, that Willie Mays played before the expanded postseason. And I got to get on my soapbox a little bit. I love stats. I love baseball, but I always kind of find it funny when I'm watching the postseason now and they say, oh, so-and-so set a postseason record. Broke Mickey Mantle's postseason record. And I want to say, let's stop here because the postseason is a lot longer now than it used to be. So that's my little caveat there. But that's fine. Gives more games, more excitement. I'm fine with that. So if you compare the postseason stats of these four players, Beltran just clearly excels. He's the only one of these four with a postseason batting average over 300, and he has the most postseason home runs, RBIs, stolen bases, total bases, and a higher slugging percentage and OPS of these four guys. So again, I'm getting ahead. We're going to talk about Beltran's postseason accolades in a bit, but Beltran really distinguished himself in the postseason. That's one of the huge components of his career. Now, if we're comparing Beltran with these three other players in the regular season, interesting point here. Beltran also had the highest stolen base percentage of the four, 86.43. In fact, that's something Beltran did very well, and that stolen base percentage is actually the highest of all time amongst players with 300 or more stolen base attempts. So again, if you're looking at his career stolen base counting numbers alone, they don't place him amongst the all-time greats, but the combination, power, speed, plus, the highest stolen base percentage, that's a really impressive Cooperstown resume. So anyway, enough of the counting stats. I know you guys are all scratching out there, the warheads, just getting ready to talk about this. Let's talk about his career WAR. That's wins above replacement. As you know, talk about for all the folks that are joining us for the first time and don't really follow baseball. It's kind of a recent statistic, and it's meant to sort of encompass all areas and aspects of a player's playing ability, and essentially, in theory, create a number that gives you this is the amount of wins this player brings to the team, both in a season and a career. And as we've talked about in some of our episodes, the 70 to 75 is kind of what I call the sweet spot. If you've got 70 or 75 or more, that's really impressive. Places you favorably amongst the all-time greats. Carlos has got a career WAR of 70.1, which is really good. Puts him in that sweet spot. It's actually tied with Gary Carter and Scott Rowland. Both of these guys in the Hall of Fame. Scott just got in. Gary Carter, one of the greatest catchers of all time. Both these guys in the Hall of Famers. So this career WAR places Carlos very favorably. And there is a lot of, I'm not going to get into all the names, but you can look on the list yourself. It's just a lot of Hall of Famers with a lower career WAR. And almost all of the players with a higher WAR are either Hall of Fame or, either in the Hall of Fame or what I call Hall of Fame caliber players. This, who they are, the list of people that, the Roses and the Bonds and A-Rod, players that aren't in for maybe some other reasons. So it just places him very favorably. Now, interestingly, between 1998 and 2017, Carlos only finished in the top 10 in WAR amongst position players in the MLB twice. It was in 2006, he was number 2 behind Albert Pujols, and then in 2008, he finished 9th. Similarly, he only finished in the top 10 in offensive WAR just once. It was 2006, he's finished second behind Derek Jeter, and he finished the top 10 in defensive WAR just once in 2008. Now, this kind of shows how Beltran, maybe this gives you fodder for the compiler argument if you're on the Beltran as a compiler train. It shows Beltran was kind of an under-the-radar player who, at the time of his retirement, you look at his stats and you're just really surprised by how good his career numbers were. It's all the more interesting considering he never led the league in any single offensive category apart from games played in 2002. Now, I know it's not an exact science, and there's a lot of variables outside of a player's control that I like to look at because it's just an easy way to demonstrate that a player was one of the best offensive players at the time. I like to put a lot of stock in whether, a player led the league in offensive categories. That being said, I've said it before, there's a lot of players in the Hall of Fame that never led the league in any offensive category, and some of them kind of get in. This is, again, fodder for the compilers. Players get in because they just put together a good career. And that's the other thing, too. I don't think he's a compiler. Now, I just read off some of the numbers. He wasn't in top 10 in WAR, and that might be, a red flag for some of the people to say, oh, he's a compiler, was never really one of the top. But let's break down, kind of a season-by-season look at Carlos's career. If you don't include his sophomore slump season of 2000, in which he played only 98 games, and a few other seasons in which injuries kept him under 100 games played, if you look at his career, in seasons in which he played full-time, and what I'm including as full-time is 130 games or more, he never really had a bad season. I know some of the Mets fans out there and maybe some Yankees fans are screaming, what? But again, with the qualifier that in seasons in which he played 130 or more games, that's 14 of his 20 seasons in Major League Baseball, he was very good. He had very good and respectable numbers for those years. And again, even though he's not leading in WAR, maybe he's an under-the-radar player. Listen to this. He had 8 seasons of 100 or more RBI. He had 8 seasons of 25 or more home runs. He had 7 seasons scoring 100 or more runs. He had 4 seasons of 30 or more stolen bases. And in fact, in 2004, he was 2 home runs short of the famous 40-40 club. The guy had 6 seasons with 300 or more total bases. So I don't think it's fair to say he's a compiler. I'm using these stats as part of my argument against the compiler moniker because, a lot of players that kind of get labeled a compiler, when you look at their career stats, they never really had impressive single seasons. They just played a long time and in the totality racked up some numbers. I mean, these are good numbers. He had a lot of good seasons with a lot of good numbers. Anyway, so I don't want to get off too much on the compiler thing. But it's fair to say, his strongest argument here statistically for the Hall of Fame certainly are those career numbers. You can't argue with those. Those are really impressive. And finally, to wrap up the stats, as you know, no discussion of statistics is complete without getting into my favorite category, of course, which is fielding statistics. Carlos played center field. And he doesn't really rank atop leaderboards except in 2 categories. He's 24th all-time in putouts. He's 7th all-time for total zone runs. So, that's impressive. There's a lot of players we discussed that don't rank on any leaderboards. So to sum up Carlos's statistical argument for the Hall of Fame, some of these career numbers we put up, you just can't ignore that. He's got a career WAR of 70, which, if you're into advanced sabermetrics, that's really impressive. Tied with Gary Carter and Scott Rowland, who just got in. And Carlos has got, arguably a lot better, career counting numbers than Rowland. As I said before, the 2 things that kind of stand out for me in terms of the counting stats, got an impressive one, but, 28th all-time in doubles, 34th all-time in career total bases with the 33 above them, just kind of a who's who of some of the greats. And then narrowing it down to the players, like we said, the 5 with 400 or more, 300 or more stolen bases, Bonds, A-Rod, Willie Mays, Dawson, and Beltran. And then when you tack on the 1,000 walks, it's just Beltran, Mays, A-Rod, and Barry Bonds. I mean, people can say, counting stats are overrated. I don't think so. I mean, say what you want. Yes, sabermetrics are important. Advanced statistics are important. It's good to get a different perspective on a player, especially when you're trying to analyze them, especially, not to get off on it. The whole thing with sabermetrics, the whole idea was that, teams that couldn't afford to sign the big stars were trying to find different ways to evaluate players' success, their probability of success, and they found some of the different numbers and stuff. And, on paper, they were making it work with players that weren't the stars. But at the end of the day, when you look at the Hall of Fame, you're looking at numbers. Hey, what did this guy do? How many numbers? What are the numbers he put up? And, that club right there, the Bonds, A-Rod, Mays, Beltran, you really can't argue with that. That's pretty impressive. And he was a good defensive center fielder. To me, the stats just kind of speak for themselves. So that gets us to our next category here. As you know, I also like to look at hardware. All right, let's look at Carlos Beltran's career hardware. Now, I say this every episode. It's probably worth repeating. Hardware can be subjective. A lot of these awards are voted on by members of the media, other players, other coaches. So there's a bit of a subjective bias that can always factor into this. That being said, a lot of players play, and not every player wins. So, if you win a major award, you got to be doing something right. So it's worth tracking, and it's interesting too, especially when you get in. I mentioned before with the stats. Sometimes it's fun to say, only these players have this combination of stats, and sometimes it's fun with hardware to say, this player or these players have combinations of these statistics, and only these players have these. So, it can be fun. And I also think it's a fun kind of snapshot or an interesting historical snapshot of, what the media or what the players or coaches thought of that player at the time. I make much of this. I feel like I'm talking about this every episode, but the 2000 MVP vote. In my Todd Helton episode, I talked about how I thought, Todd Helton really should have won, but Jeff Kent did win it. It's kind of fun to go back sometimes and sort of revote MVPs based on a modern take. But again, it's a snapshot at the time of kind of what people were thinking. I mentioned on the Sheffield episode, I was reading the book Game of Shadows. I read the part recently where they were talking about the 2000 MVP vote. And I mentioned, I think on one of the episodes that, Barry Bonds that year had an argument for the 2000 MVP as well. And it went to his teammate Jeff Kent. And they kind of talk about that in the Game of Shadows book. It's kind of interesting. And, a lot of the media, there's some subjective bias. They thought Kent just did more for the team. Bonds took some games off or something. And I think also, too, Bonds kind of rubbed some of the journalists the wrong way. So I don't get off on that. But so there, obviously there's some subjective factors there. But that being said, Carlos has a pretty impressive hardware argument for the Hall of Fame. He never won an MVP award, but he did win the 1999 American League Rookie of the Year award with the Kansas City Royals. As we mentioned before, he had a really good year that year. He was a 9-time All-Star. He also won 3 Gold Gloves and 2 Silver Sluggers. Now, this is what I think is probably one of his more impressive hardware arguments. Although he never won an MVP award, he did get MVP votes in 7 seasons, including 2 top 10 finishes. His highest finish was 2006 when he finished 4th. I've said this before, I'll say it again. It's one of the things I like to mention on these episodes. To me, I think it almost makes a better Cooperstown case if you don't win an MVP but consistently get votes in multiple seasons. There's a lot of players that kind of, one and done. They win an MVP and maybe they get votes in another season and that's about it. But to me, MVP votes in 7 seasons, again, the MVP isn't the end-all, be-all in whether or not a player had a good season. But the fact that you're on the radar of the national journalists to the point where, you get MVP votes in 7 different seasons, that's really good. Now, I've talked about this on my Chase Utley episode. I thought, a smaller, shorter peak, isn't going to get you in the Hall of Fame. But as I've mentioned, Carlos has the career stats to back it up. So I say he got MVP votes in 7 seasons. That doesn't mean he only had 7 good seasons. He had other good seasons too. He just got MVP votes in 7 seasons. So that's impressive for me. Another thing too, I said at the beginning it's going to be an interesting episode. They're all interesting episodes. Every player is different. This is the first time I've talked about this. While he played for the St. Louis Cardinals, Beltran won the 2013 Roberto Clemente Award. This is an award, if you're unfamiliar, it's given annually to the player who, quote, best exemplifies the game of baseball, sportsmanship, community involvement, and the individual's contribution to his team. Now, again, I want people that aren't baseball fans to listen to this podcast, like this podcast. So a lot of what I say, if it's repetitive, I'm sorry. But if you're unfamiliar with who Roberto Clemente is, you might have some young people listening to this podcast. Roberto Clemente, outstanding player who also tragically died in a plane crash going to try to do some rescue work after an earthquake. So this award is in his honor. It's a big deal. It's just given to players that do a lot off the field. And the reason why Beltran won that award is because of his work with what's called the Carlos Beltrán Baseball Academy in Puerto Rico. I looked up on the Academy's website. It's really interesting. It's a high school that helps kids in his native Puerto Rico excel both academically and athletically. It's basically a really cool idea. It's kind of like Hogwarts, but for baseball. People go there and they go to school and they learn baseball. And if you go on their website, there's cool pictures. There's a picture of like Pedro Martinez showing up and showing kids how to pitch. I'm like, this is cool. I wish I went to this school. That's pretty cool. So, and according to the school's website, one of their most notable students is Giovanni Moron. He was class of 2015. He actually went on to become a pitcher. He's the current pitcher for the Minnesota Twins. So, they got Major League Baseball players coming out of this academy. I'm sure it's not going to be the last. I'm sure there's going to be more. So I think that's important. It's worth noting. There's a lot of awards that Major League Baseball is giving out in addition to just MVP, Cy Young awards. And this is one of them. The Roberto Clemente Award's really good. So, again, doesn't... maybe we're getting to the fame factor a little bit, but it just gets to his character off the field. But we'll talk about the fame factor a little bit as well. So another thing that's important, it's great that Beltran's involved in his community back home in Puerto Rico. I should also mention that although we really don't count the stats toward the Hall of Fame, Beltran's also played in 4 different Puerto Rican teams in the World Baseball Classic. Now, brief segue here. I admit I was very slow to get on the WBC train. WBC makes it sound like a wrestling league. World Baseball, I think about the WCW back in the day. I was kind of slow to get on this train. And to date, I really haven't seen any Hall of Fame candidates who've had their World Baseball Classic experiences discussed as part of their Hall of Fame case. Just because of it's a newer thing. But now players, this is another reason why his candidacy is interesting, because now you're getting a player on the ballot who had an extensive WBC career. And I just think it's interesting. Is this going to be something that factors into voters' considerations or no? For me, you have to look at it as an exhibition, and maybe it gets into the fame factor because if I get on soapbox a little bit of a segue, I did watch this year's 2023 World Baseball Classic. If you didn't watch it, I didn't watch it for years because I thought it was it's just an exhibition, but I kind of forced myself. I said, I'm going to give it a try this year, and I got to say, I'm glad I did. If you didn't watch it, the 2023 World Baseball Classic, the final was Team USA versus Japan. It's just incredible. It ended, spoiler alert, it ended with Ohtani striking out Mike Trout to win the World Baseball Classic for Japan. It was just electrifying. And I think it was just one of the highlights, if not the highlight of the 2023 season. So anyway, I don't want to get off on the World Baseball Classic, but it's worth noting there for Carlos's hardware that, he did play in the World Baseball Classic 4 times, and that kind of adds to, his legacy a little bit. Last thing I'll say about that, I think if Ohtani ever gets in the Hall of Fame, which I think he will, it doesn't really count, but it's definitely one of those moments people are going to bring up. I think it's going to be one of these moments 10, 20 years from now you're going to remember. Remember that time Ohtani struck out Mike Trout? So it's interesting. I'm curious. If you're a Hall of Fame voter, if you listen to this podcast, if you follow me on Twitter, let me know your thoughts. Comment on Twitter. Shoot me a message or an email. I'm curious if the WBC career of Beltran or other players is going to factor into your voting considerations for the Hall of Fame. Just out of curiosity. Now, finally, with regard to the hardware factor, as you know, I always love to look at a player's postseason accolades. And for me, if a player has just an incredible body of work in the regular season, even if they kind of don't do well in the postseason, they're still going to get in the Hall of Fame. But for players that are maybe seen as somewhat borderline candidates, whether or not they do well in the postseason does matter. And I think for me, if I were voting, it does move the needle either in their favor or against their favor. I keep saying I feel bad, but kind of picked on Billy Wagner a little bit in my episode. He had some struggles in the playoffs, and if I were voting, I think he's kind of a borderline candidate. He's a good pitcher, definitely a good pitcher, but the postseason struggles, I don't know if that would get my vote. Now, in Carlos's case, he's arguably one of the best playoff players of all time. So much so, and we're getting to the fame factor a little bit, but he earned the nickname Señor Octubre, which is, of course, a play on Reggie Jackson's Mr. October moniker. So he was great in the postseason. In 65 playoff games, he had a slash line of 307, a 412, and 609. He had 15 doubles, a triple, 16 home runs, 42 RBIs, 45 runs, and 11 stolen bases. He was incredible. And if you're looking, I'm looking here on Baseball Reference. If you're a baseball fan, you know this website. If not, look it up. It's fun. It's where I get a lot of these stats. Just if you go by like a series by series breakdown, 2004 in the NLDS, he batted .455 with 4 home runs and 9 RBIs and 2 stolen bases. And then in the 2004 NLCS, he batted .417, 4 home runs, 5 RBIs. I mean, this guy came to play. And then if you look in the 2006 NLCS, batted .296, 3 home runs, 4 RBIs. Skipping ahead to 2012 NLDS, he hit .444 with 2 home runs and 4 RBIs and a stolen base. In the 2012 NLCS, batted .300 with a home run, 2 RBIs. The guy was just, 2013 NLDS. Now, he hit only .222, but he had 2 home runs and 6 RBIs. So, the guy was just, even in 2017, towards the end of his career with the Houston Astros, in the ALDS that year, he batted .400, and he had an RBI. So, that's pretty impressive. He was a very good postseason player. So, if we were making the case for Carlos Beltran, for me, Carlos's postseason success is just one of his strongest arguments in favor of induction. You can't ignore his body of work in the postseason. And to sort of finish it off here, I want to point out 2 things. In 2004, Carlos tied Barry Bonds' single postseason record of 8 home runs. And he also has the highest stolen base percentage in the playoffs. He's 11 for 11. Never got caught stealing in the postseason. So, you can't ignore his postseason accolades. But ironically, though, it would be something that occurred allegedly in the postseason that may be Carlos's undoing. And again, one of the reasons why his Hall of Fame case is an interesting one. So that brings us to our final factor. As you know, I like to discuss the fame factor, the sizzle on the bacon. What brings somebody to the Hall of Fame to look at a player's plaque and to reminisce about a player's career? You know, if you've ever been to Cooperstown, I've never been there. One of the reasons why I haven't is because it's not really that easy to get to. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere. I shouldn't say that, but it's in the middle of upstate New York. I've driven on the road that goes by, and I've seen the exit for Cooperstown, and this was years ago, and I pulled over and said, how far is it? And the guy said, well, it's about an hour drive, and well, I was going somewhere, I didn't have time, so you have to just be going there. You can't be on your way and stop by. There's really no way to get there unless you specifically make an attempt to go, and especially if you're coming from the West Coast, it's days and days of travel. So, you know, you got to ask yourself, am I going to take a family vacation, take time out from work to go to great lengths to travel to see, this player's plaque? So it's a big deal, not to find a point on it. But Carlos Beltran, in terms of his fame factor, as you said, he's kind of an under-the-radar player. He's not necessarily someone that when you were watching, you would say, all right, children, grandchildren, watch this guy. This is one of the greatest to ever play the game or something. But, he was still very good. I never watched Carlos Beltran and thought, oh, he's not a Hall of Famer. I always respected him. And he had a lot of good years on the Mets, kind of a rival of the Braves. I always watched him, and I respect him. He was a good player year in, year out. He wasn't necessarily grabbing the headlines, but he was certainly a very good player. For me, he had, a fame factor. One of the things, too, he bounced around teams a lot. I'll talk about this briefly. I don't really hold that against some players. It's kind of weird. Players that play their whole career for one team are so rare, and it's kind of like an unwritten thing that helps your Hall of Fame case. We talked about that with Todd Helton and Joe Mauer. It's just because it's so rare. Nobody plays their whole career with one team. I think some people hold that against players. I don't. I mean, look, if you're in your career, sometimes you switch jobs. You don't know what's going on behind the scenes. Sometimes players want to get traded because they have disagreements with the coach or players, or maybe they're on a losing team and they're tired of losing. They want to go play somewhere. They win a ring or something like that. So I'm not going to hold that against him. But he was everywhere he went. He was always, like I said, with the exception of some seasons where he was hurt, he was always pretty good. When he was healthy and he was playing, full time, he was a good player. So he was also a great postseason player. And again, if you're making an elevator pitch, the career counting stats plus the Señor Octubre, great playoff player. That just makes, for a really compelling Cooperstown case. Finally, talked about at the end. I can't, I always try to be objective. I don't want to get into, the dirt on players and stuff, but I can't have an episode about players without mentioning certain things. And we have to mention, of course, the 2017 Astros scandal. If you're a newbie to baseball and you're listening to this podcast, you don't know what happened. 2017, the Houston Astros won the World Series. It turns out there was some reports a few years later. I think the story really broke. Ken Rosenthal wrote an article in The Athletic. And long story short, there was a sign stealing operation, I guess you would call it. They were stealing signs and making noises on banging trash cans and stuff to report, what pitches were coming. I don't really want to get into it. You can go on YouTube. John Boy Media has some great breakdowns. There's some great YouTube videos explaining in detail. I mean, I'm sure you could probably write several books all about it. There's a lot of information out there. All I'm going to say is, it's kind of a bit of a, black mark on baseball. And Carlos Beltran, by all accounts, from what I've read, was kind of the ringleader. One of the people that was sort of, kind of taking the lead on this. So I think it's interesting because I'm curious, as I said in the beginning, how this is going to impact his Hall of Fame voting if it does. Without getting too far into it, again, there's people that have written a lot more than I have and can talk. I don't want to get too far into it, but I do think it is a bit of a knock against him in the fame factor. It's a bit of a black mark on his fame factor and his career. But, that being said, he did pay the cost. He was going to be the manager of the Mets, and he actually lost his job because of that. So, if you think that some punishment or retribution should be in order, he certainly lost his job. So there's a bit of a retribution. This is probably a discussion for another time and another place. You could dedicate a whole podcast episode to this. Is the Astros scandal comparable with the PED scandal and steroids? I don't think it is. I'm not condoning it. I'm not justifying it. And in all fairness, in recent years, much has been made of this Astros scandal. In fact, there was a football game recently when the announcers made a joke. Somebody was banging on drums or something, and the announcer made a joke about whether the Astros were there. It's kind of entered, the public lexicon here. So it's not something that's going to go away. And I'm curious to see if Beltran's Hall of Fame case is hampered by it, because it pains me to say this. This is the conversation that people are having with Jose Altuve, and they say, "Oh, is Jose going to get in the Hall of Fame?" And look, I say this because it's definitely fun to pick on the Astros, and I was enjoying the Joe Kelly incident just like everybody else did. They're a great sort of boogeyman right now in baseball. In pro wrestling, they call it a heel. The bad guy. The Astros have been a great heel for the past few years because, the baseball, people want the baseball gods, want retribution for kind of what happened. But look, that was a few years ago. We're moving forward. I don't know if that, in my opinion, would impact my vote negatively for a Hall of Fame player. It's just me. But if you disagree with me, let me know why. Shoot me some messages on Twitter. Or shoot me an email at thecase4podcast@gmail.com. So, finally, wrapping things up here, if I look at the totality of his counting stats, his total bases, his doubles, the home run, stolen base, walk combination, plus the postseason accolades, plus some respectable hardware, for me, if I had a vote, Carlos Beltrán would get my vote to be in the Hall of Fame. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please check out my other episodes and stay tuned for my next episode where we discuss Bobby Abreu. Until then, remember, when life gets you down, stop what you're doing and watch a baseball game.